Hello, I'm Nate, aka B-Tier Mutineer, and today in my B-Tier guides for Dragon Age Inquisition, I'm going to take you through a build guide for Dorian, my favorite mage companion in DAI. As much as I love Dorian as a character, you'll see that the mage builds I'm able to create in Inquisition are far less varied and interesting compared to the ones I made for the Warden and their companions in Origins. It's just the way the mage ability trees are designed. The designers clearly didn't want mages to feel as overpowered, especially in terms of having more spells to choose from than the abilities offered to the martial classes, but that makes mage gameplay unfortunately just a lot less interesting. However, as is always the case with my builds, I try to focus on lore and character-friendly choices rather than the optimal min-maxing ones. For this reason, you'll see that I won't recommend extremely specific or overpowered crafted items. Inquisition's crafting system is broken, and if you abuse it to create the most overpowered items, it takes away from the fun and excitement of fighting enemies, as well as finding cool new items while playing the game. So as part of the recommended gear section, I will give you the main stats I think are good for crafted items, but you can also look for these stats in the items you loot or obtain as rewards for playing the game. Without further ado, let's get into the build. Dorian gets recruited a bit later in the game than the starting companions, so he'll be higher level when you add him to your party, and thus have more points you can assign to him. It depends on what level your Inquisitor is when he joins your party, either during the Mage quest or when Haven is attacked if you chose the Templars. I believe he doesn't come with any abilities unlocked, which can be quite problematic in the first fight against the Venatori during the Mage main quest. I will recommend some starting abilities for Dorian based on the recommended level range of the Mage main quest, which is 4 to 7. I'll assume you're level 5, in the middle of the level range, and thus offer 6 abilities I recommend you unlock for Dorian. For his spells, I take into consideration Dorian's flamboyant personality, his starting fire staff, his superior knowledge of magic compared to most mages outside of the Imperium, as well as his apparent enjoyment of being seen as the weird and spooky defender. So this build will focus on fire, making enemies panic, as well as spells that look flashy or which in some way feel more advanced. Thus, I recommend unlocking the following spells from the Inferno tree, Flashfire and Immolate, and taking the Blistering Pain upgrade for Flashfire. Flashfire ignites an enemy and sends them fleeing in panic. It's a great single target spell, and I especially like to use it against a melee enemy who is approaching my mage in order to make them panic and run away instead of attacking the squishy mage. Immolate is an AoE fire spell, which unleashes a massive explosion that burns enemies in an area. I'll also recommend an upgrade for it later, but in the beginning it's fine as is. It also acts as an Eldritch detonator for combos. The best combo to use it for is the Nightmare combo, using Immolate on a sleeping enemy, because the burning effect's damage over time doesn't remove the fear effect of the combo. From the Spirit tree, unlock Barrier, the passive ability Peaceful Aura, and Dispel. Barrier is the most useful utility spell that I frankly recommend you unlock on any mage, or at least on one of your mages if you run 2 mages in your party like I do. This spell has an area of effect which causes any allies within it to gain a barrier which acts as an additional health bar that must be destroyed before the target will take any damage. This magical shield does decay over time, but it's extremely useful. I particularly use it on my frontline characters, the tank, as well as a melee damager if I have one, to give them extra defenses since they will be the ones attacked most often by enemies. Peaceful Aura is a nice passive ability which reduces the threat the mage generates when attacking enemies, making enemies less likely to target the mage. It also grants a bonus of +3 willpower. Finally, Dispel is a spell I like to have on at least one mage in my party, if not both, because it has great utility. You can dispel enemy spells such as barriers and ice or fire mines. More importantly, and the main reason I love this spell, is that you can use it on those green bubbling points which spawn a demon called Rupture Points at the start of a new enemy wave of a Fade Rift. The Rupture Point doesn't need to be exactly within the spell's area of effect to be dispelled. It's best if you can place the circle between 2 Rupture Points, no more than a meter away from either one, so that you dispel as many Rupture Points as possible. You can also use Dispel as an Eldritch Detonator ability on incapacitated enemies for a combo effect. The best disabling effects to use this as a detonator for are Sleep and Stun effects. Sleep plus Eldritch Detonator equals Nightmare, which grants a large spirit damage bonus and inflicts panic on the target. Stun plus Eldritch Detonator equals Weaken, which also grants a large spirit damage bonus and inflicts weakness on the target. Moving on to the rest of the recommended abilities for Dorian. I will mention them in a few categories based on the level ranges I think they should be unlocked at: early, mid, late, and super late. As a note, you don't need to force yourself to do a million side quests or grind respawning enemies to reach the max level 27. A character's power in Inquisition comes from gear, as well as the strategic combination of a few key abilities. And anyway, if you're playing through all of the DLCs, you should be able to reach quite a high level. If you find you're constantly out-leveling enemies, I recommend switching on the Even Ground trial, which causes all enemies to scale to be at least the same level as the Inquisitor. This will allow you to get full experience points for defeating them. For the early game, which is until level 7, I only have 2 more points to recommend since you recruit Dorian quite late. There is a very important thing to talk about when it comes to mages: their elemental damage. Mage staves have a particular element damage type associated with them, which makes the mage's auto attacks with the staff deal damage of that element. This can be a bit of a problem when you deal with enemies who are immune to a particular element. I mention this here because this can also be a problem if you over-specialize your mage into one element and don't have other elemental spells to damage enemies with. We'll also discuss staves later on in the gear section, but in order to ensure that at least a couple of the spells Dorian uses will always be useful against enemies, this is the point where I recommend you take 2 active spells with different damage types from fire: Winter's Grasp from the Winter Tree and Chain Lightning from the Storm Tree. Winter's Grasp is a single target spell which deals cold damage to an enemy and freezes it in place, or at the very least chills it if it's immune to being frozen. This spell also initializes a freeze combo, which you can best detonate with impact or precision abilities from warriors of rogues. Things like Shield Bash, Mighty Blow, Longshot, Twin Fangs, and so on. Combining freeze with impact or precision abilities will cause the shatter effect, which deals a large amount of cold damage to the enemy. Chain Lightning is an AoE spell which shocks one initial target with electricity damage and arcs to nearby targets as well. This is not a great spell against a single target, such as a boss, since it's designed to be used against multiple enemies, but you will fight groups of enemies very often, so it's still very useful to have. If you're interested in getting a better single target electric-based spell, then I recommend unlocking Lightning Bolt later on. I'll include it as an optional unlock to replace Chain Lightning at a higher level. Moving on to the mid-game abilities from level 8 to 15. At this point, Dorian has 2 strong fire spells, 2 utility spells from the Spirit Tree, and 1 ice and 1 lightning damage spell. The main focus now is to improve Dorian's existing spells and get him some good passive abilities. Once he reaches level 11, focus on his Necromancer specialization to unlock the final 2 active spells on his ability bar, with great passives from that tree as well. When Dorian reaches level 8, I offer 2 choices. One is to improve his Chain Lightning spell with the Arcing Surge upgrade, which makes the lightning hit enemies in a larger area, as well as have 2 additional strikes. The other choice, if you want Dorian to have a better single target lightning spell, is to unlock the Lightning Bolt spell, which summons a bolt of electricity that blasts and paralyzes a single target. If other enemies are nearby, the bolt will paralyze the target for longer. Personally, I prefer using Chain Lightning and upgrading it, but I think it's good for you to know that you can get Lightning Bolt for better damage against single enemies. If you do pick up Lightning Bolt, then at level 9 I offer 2 choices for passive abilities. With Lightning Bolt, pick up the Gathering Storm passive, which causes each basic attack to shorten the mage's active cooldowns by 0.5 seconds, and it also grants a +3 to magic. If you don't have Lightning Bolt, then I recommend unlocking the Rejuvenating Barrier passive from the Spirit Tree, which causes anyone in the party with an active barrier to regain mana or stamina more quickly. It also grants the mage +3 Constitution. At level 10, I recommend unlocking the Wildfire upgrade for the Immolate spell. This increases the fire and burning damage of the spell, as well as reducing its cooldown by 4 seconds, allowing you to use it more often. From level 11, specialization abilities become available, and Dorian's Necromancer specialization is actually useful, so we'll unlock 2 great spells from there, as well as good upgrades and passives. At level 11, unlock the Horror spell. It unleashes spirits of fear that make all enemies within its area of effect panic. At level 12, get the Blinding Terror passive, which causes all party members to gain 15% bonus damage when attacking panicked and feared enemies. It also grants the mage +3 to magic. At level 13, unlock the Simulacrum passive, which is really just a prerequisite for the next spell in the tree, but could potentially be useful. If Dorian is knocked unconscious, a spirit will temporarily take on his likeness and fight on his behalf for 10 seconds. The spirit draws magic directly from the Fade, and thus will cast spells without any mana cost. Dorian won't be able to be revived until the spirit disappears. At level 14, you'll unlock the final spell on your active ability bar, Walking Bomb. This spell curses an enemy, dealing continuous spirit damage to it, and then triggers the curse in a devastating explosion. You have the option to detonate the explosion manually, or let Walking Bomb kill the target. The detonation causes spirit damage and a knockdown effect. If you have friendly fire enabled, this explosion will also affect your party members if they're nearby. Walking Bomb is actually one of the most satisfying spells to cast in Dragon Age Origins, so I love that they kept it in DA2 and Inquisition as well. Kind of annoying that it's at the very end of a specialization tree, but at least it's there. At level 15, upgrade Walking Bomb with the Virulent upgrade, which causes the effect to spread to nearby enemies if Walking Bomb kills the initial target, thus causing secondary explosions. Now we get to the late game, aka levels 16 through 23. Since you've unlocked all the active spells now, all you need to do is get the best upgrades and passives you can. From the Necromancer tree, get the Terror upgrade for the Horror spell, as well as the passives Death Siphon and Power of the Dead. The Terror upgrade causes enemies struck by horror to cower in place instead of running away. They will also not react to attacks until they take damage equal to 25% of their HP or until the horror effect fades, whichever comes first. Death Siphon causes the mage to regain health and mana whenever an enemy dies near them. They regain 20 mana and 10% health. This passive also grants +3 Constitution when unlocked. Power of the Dead increases the damage of the Necromancer's spells by 20% for 10 seconds whenever the Necromancer lands a killing blow on an enemy. The passive also grants +3 willpower when unlocked. Each enemy killed by the Necromancer grants an independent instance of the status effect, each lasting 10 seconds, so you can stack multiple instances of Power of the Dead additively. So if you have 2 stacks active at the same time, your spells gain +40% bonus damage. From the Inferno tree, pick up 3 great passives: Flashpoint, Pyromancer, and Clean Burn. Flashpoint makes the next spell after you land a critical hit to not trigger a cooldown. This effect can only occur once every 10 seconds. You also get +3 magic when unlocking this. Pyromancer increases the burning and fear durations of your spells by 25%. You also get +3 willpower. Clean Burn makes every spell you cast shorten your current active cooldowns by 1 second. You also get +3 willpower. From the Winter tree, upgrade Winter's Grasp with the Winter's Chill effect, and pick up the Winter's Stillness passive. Winter's Chill causes Winter's Grasp to damage and chill enemies within 3 meters of the initial target. Only the initial target is frozen, but nonetheless it can be a useful thing to damage and chill other targets too. Winter Stillness increases the mage's mana regeneration rate by 50% and their cooldown reduction by 33% when they stand still. Most of the time you'll want your mage to stand still and cast spells or use staff auto attacks, so this is a great utility passive to have. You could even unlock this passive earlier in the game instead of upgrading Chain Lightning since it's really good. Finally, we've reached the super late game portion from levels 24 to 27. At this point, Dorian's build is already great and he doesn't really need anything. However, you can always pick up upgrades for your remaining spells or useful passive abilities. I'll give you a few more options than 4, and I'll let you choose what you want to unlock if you even reach this high of a level during your playthrough. You could upgrade your Barrier spell. Both upgrades are great. Elegant Defense reduces barriers cooldown by 4 seconds when the barrier you cast expires. Energetic Defense causes the barrier to stay at full strength for 5 seconds until it begins to decay. I would personally choose the second upgrade because you already have some cooldown reduction bonuses from other passives. You could also upgrade your Dispel with the Strengthened Veil effect. This causes Dispel to reduce the damage of affected enemies' magical attacks by 40% for 10 seconds. This to me is a great thing to use when fighting spellcasters, especially on higher difficulties or with certain trials turned on because they can be very annoying to deal with when they keep casting barriers upon themselves as well as dealing a lot of damage with their spells. If you find that you're struggling against such spellcasters earlier in the game, feel free to upgrade Dorian's Dispel with Strengthened Veil earlier on to have this damage reduction against enemy mages. Personally, I'm usually fine, so I don't bother upgrading my Dispel, but it's a decent option. If you haven't picked it up already, the Rejuvenating Barrier passive in the Spirit Tree is very nice, granting party members who have an active barrier increased mana or stamina regen. Even if you're fine using Chain Lightning and don't need the Lightning Bolt spell for single target electricity damage, I still recommend unlocking it in order to get to the Gathering Storm passive that I mentioned earlier, which reduces your active cooldowns by 0.5 seconds for each staff basic attack. Within the Storm Tree, there's another nice passive to have, Static Charge. Enemies that attempt to interrupt your casting with attacks are struck with arcs that leave them paralyzed. They receive electricity damage and are paralyzed for 2 seconds. The damage portion of this passive might be bugged, but the paralyze effect is still useful, so I recommend it nonetheless. There's also a decent little passive in the Winter Tree in case static charge doesn't interest you, Mana Surge, which causes your barrier to explode into wild magic if an enemy destroys it. The resulting blast freezes all enemies within 3 meters of the mage, and also allows you to cast your next spell without consuming mana. It seems like this effect will trigger even if your mage's barrier just depletes on its own, not just when an enemy destroys it. In that case, it's even more powerful of an effect, especially in terms of being able to cast your next spell without consuming mana. Finally, in case you will want to mainly use an ice-based staff on Dorian, I'll discuss later reasons for having staves of different elements to switch out for certain fights, then you will want to pick up the Frost Mastery passive, which increases your mage's effectiveness when chilling or freezing targets. Ice damage staves have auto attacks that also inflict a chill effect, and so increasing that effect is very useful. Of course, the freeze and chill effects of Winter's Grasp will also be improved. Before we move on to gear, let me just say that you don't necessarily have to unlock the abilities I mentioned exactly in the order I mentioned them. I find it easier to talk about level ranges as well as recommend specific abilities for each level, just because it structures the guide a bit better. But feel free to just make a note of the abilities I recommend and decide for yourself which ones you want to unlock early and which ones you're keeping for later. And if there's some spell or ability that you personally don't find useful or that you don't enjoy using, such as I imagine Dispel might not necessarily be everyone's cup of tea, then feel free to ignore that ability and choose something else to replace it, based on what I've discussed in this section. There's not very much to talk about in terms of Dorian's starting gear. It's very basic and needs to be upgraded as soon as possible. He starts out with an Igneous Staff, which deals fire damage and has plus 3% attack, and an Enchanter Coat with plus 6% spirit resistance. I would in particular switch out Dorian's staff immediately if possible, into either an ice or lightning based staff, simply because in the early game I recommended you focus on fire spells as his main damaging spells, with Chain Lightning and Winter's Grasp being unlocked towards the end of the early game. There are enemies who are resistant or even immune to fire, and so it's extremely important for Dorian to be able to damage them more effectively, even if that is just with his basic attacks. As for the gear I recommend for him, you want to improve Dorian's offensive stats. I don't bother with defensive stats for characters who stay at range, because your tank and frontline damagers will be drawing most of the enemy aggression anyway, so you don't need to worry about defenses. The only defensive stat I do like to give to my non-tanks is maximum health, because if they get attacked or damaged by something, they'll be able to take more damage until the tank redirects the enemy's attacks, and they will also be able to heal up more with something like a regeneration potion. These are the important stats to look out for in looted staves, helmets, and armors, or stats you want to focus on when you craft gear for your mage. For primary stats, aka attributes, Magic, and as a secondary attribute, Willpower. Magic increases mage's attack score by 0.5% for each point above 10, and it also increases barrier damage bonus by 1% per point above 10. Willpower increases attack for all classes by 0.5% per point above 10, and also increases magic defense by 0.5% per point above 10. Magic is more important because it increases not just attack but also damage against barriers, whereas the magic defense bonus from willpower isn't really relevant. You may not care very much about damage versus barriers since you will have Dispel to get rid of them, but in case Dispel is on cooldown or you're not using it, it's not bad to have this bonus from your magic attribute. For offensive stats, attack, armor penetration, and sunder or stagger on hit. Mostly I'd focus on attack and armor penetration. Attack increases all the damage that your character does, and each point of armor penetration ignores 1 point of the target's armor when inflicting damage. Sunder on hit is a percentage chance per hit to inflict a sunder effect on the target. Sunder reduces a target's armor, and this effect lasts a few seconds. Stagger on hit is similar, being a percentage chance per hit to stun the target, with the effect also lasting a few seconds. Out of these secondary stats, I would focus more on stagger on hit, since you can have armor penetration to deal with enemy armor, so disabling an enemy for a few seconds with a stun is much more useful. In terms of crafting materials, you want cloth in the utility slot to increase magic and willpower, mainly metal in the offense slot, which can increase attack, armor penetration, stagger on hit, or sunder on hit, and as a secondary option, cloth in the offense slot, which has some options that increase attack. And for the defense slot, if you can't have a utility or offense slot, as is often the case with armor, I recommend metal for a maximum health bonus, but a leather material that grants ranged defense or a cloth material that grants magic defense are also decent options. Generally speaking, melee enemies should really be busy attacking the party's tank, but occasionally you could get attacked by ranged enemies such as archers or wraiths. The best types of crafting schematics to focus on for Dorian are ones with good utility and offense slots. Avoid defense slots as much as you can, since those don't help Dorian with his damage. Before we get into schematics, I need you to know something important about staves. As I've mentioned previously in the abilities section, it's useful to have a good staff dealing each elemental damage type in your inventory. Staves can deal fire, ice, or lightning damage, so be sure to have one of each element as spare staves for your mages. I personally like to use lightning or ice staves most of the time because I like the chill and shock effects more than the burning effect that fire staff basic attacks have. But of course, you could mainly use a fire staff on Dorian to keep it more on theme, and only switch to ice or lightning when a strong enemy is immune or resistant to fire. I'm not suggesting you need to know all boss enemies' immunities and weaknesses in advance. The best thing to do is save before you go into a difficult fight, and quickly check the enemy's weaknesses and immunities with the tactical camera. If Dorian or your other mages already have a suitable elemental staff equipped, then you can continue the fight normally. If the boss is immune or resistant to the element of your mage's staves, reload the save before the fight, or run away to disengage from the fight if possible, and switch the staves with suitable spares from your inventory. This should make boss fights much easier, especially if you like to have multiple mages in your party like I do. For the best staves or staff schematics, you need to focus on cloth utility, which offers magic and willpower, and ideally metal offense, with which you can get the offensive stats I mentioned earlier. It can also be fine if the schematic has leather or cloth offense, because you can get attack from cloth offense and sunder on hit from leather offense slots. The most important things to avoid are metal or leather utility slots, because those will increase attributes which Dorian simply doesn't care about as a damager mage: strength, dexterity, constitution, and cunning. I recommend keeping an eye out for rare or unique staves you find as loot, especially the unique ones, which could have some very nice bonus effects that you wouldn't necessarily have with regular crafted staves. I really like the Blizzard's Path cold damage staff, which has an on-kill effect of making the target explode and deal damage to nearby enemies, similar to the spell Walking Bomb. Blizzard's Path can be looted as part of the quest The Trouble with Darkspawn and the Western Approach. There are plenty of other unique staves you can find by doing cool side content such as killing dragons or wyverns, or solving other side quests, some in the base game and others in DLC areas. For staff upgrades, use schematics that have the same type of slots I mentioned earlier: cloth utility and metal offense. You may find some staff upgrade pieces as loot as well, especially already attached to a rare or unique staff looted in the wild. You can remove these upgrades at the blacksmith and put them on another staff if you like them. However, don't stress about upgrade pieces. Upgrades don't add huge numbers to your weapon stats because they use small amounts of materials, so just add whatever you can that has some kind of useful bonus. Finally, still in the weapon category is where I'll include my recommendations for which rune to slot into your staff. For staves, I will always recommend spirit runes. This is for the simple fact that very few spells deal spirit damage, and you can't craft staves with their base damage being spirit. This is a very unfortunate design decision, but at least you can slot a spirit rune into your mage's staves so that they can deal at least a small amount of spirit damage to enemies with each attack. To my knowledge, no enemy is resistant or immune to spirit damage, so even if you find yourself in a bad situation with, let's say, a fire staff against a fire immune enemy, if you have a spirit rune slotted into your staff, you'll still be doing some damage with your staff's basic attacks. Moving on to armor. Helmets are the ugliest thing in the game, but they can add a decent amount of armor rating and stats to your character. Whereas with staves, you're more likely to get offense slots. With helmets, you can find good ones with cloth utility slots to increase your magic and willpower. Since there aren't that many helmet schematics in total, here are all the good ones with cloth utility slots: the Tier 1 Templar Scribe Cowl, Tier 2 Battle Mage Cowl and Inquisitor Hat, and Tier 3 Battle Mage Cowl, Seer Cowl, or Superior Seer Cowl. I don't recommend any of the Tier 4 schematics because they have metal utility or cloth defense, none of which you want for your Damager Mage. I personally use the Seer Cowl or the Superior Seer Cowl if I have it. In terms of looted helmets, it will very likely be difficult to find a good one with high magic or willpower bonuses, so I do recommend crafting your mage helmet if you can. In terms of light armor, the same cloth utility focus applies. There are only defense and utility slots on armor, just like with helmets. Just make sure you get a schematic with some cloth utility in there, or if you're looking at looted armor pieces, try to find ones with magic or willpower bonuses. For armor upgrades, arms and legs, either focus on cloth utility for magic and willpower, or else go for metal defense and increase maximum health. Moving on to accessories. Belts can be quite weak, at least the common ones. However, rare and unique ones can be very nice. For mages, there is an interesting subset of rare belts, which make abilities that are based on a particular element to be more powerful at the cost of some of the mage's maximum health. For Dorian, you'd be interested in a Belt of the Inferno Pact, which would improve his flash fire and immolate spells, as well as increasing the fire damage he deals with his basic fire attacks. This belt is only available as a random trials reward, however, so you may have to wait for a long time to get one in your rewards chest, and you're required to have at least one trial active. There's also an enhanced Belt of the Inferno Pact, which replaces the previous one as a random trials reward after you reach level 13. Finally, a unique version of this belt exists, but it's unfortunately part of the Trespasser DLC, so at that point I don't really know how much you care about upgrading your gear, since you already have a full powerful build. If you want a belt which is easier to acquire, something that increases maximum health is decent. There's rare and unique belts with this effect, or you could also use a belt that increases ranged defense or magic defense. For amulets, the best one by far for pretty much any damager character is the cooldown amulet, to reduce the character's ability cooldowns. You can find common and rare options, and also some unique amulets, such as the Master Cooldown Amulet or Superb Cooldown Amulet. However, if you don't care as much about cooldown reduction, then I can recommend a few other options. An amulet with magic or willpower bonuses is always good, because these attributes increase your attack score and thus all your damage with attacks and spells. You can find these types of amulets in common, rare, and unique variants. An amulet that makes you generate less threat when attacking, called an Amulet of Accord, is also nice, and you can find it in either rare or unique tier, with the unique one being a random trials reward. Finally, a really cool unique amulet is the Amulet of Renewal, which grants a bonus to mana or stamina regen. You can either loot it or receive it from Imshael in Emprise du Lion as part of the Call Me Imshael side quest. For rings, you're interested in the types of offensive stats I mentioned at the start of the gear section: attack, armor penetration, and stagger or sunder on hit. You can also look for rare rings that increase the damage or effectiveness of a particular spell. For Dorian, the good ability rings would be for Barrier, Walking Bomb, or Winter's Grasp. But I'd personally focus on rare or unique rings that give you good offensive bonuses, especially attack, because they increase your combat effectiveness for all your attacks and damaging spells, not just one. The Barrier ring is somewhat special because you can't really improve the power of your barriers with regular stats. So you could have a Barrier ring and a second ring with offensive stats if you want to improve Dorian's barriers. Let's move on to tactics, where I discuss how to set up Dorian's automatic behavior in combat, which abilities to set to preferred, which ones to keep as just active, and which ones should be disabled, either because they're not worth spending resources on, or because you need to use them manually. Unfortunately, this is the extent of Inquisition's tactics menu, so you can't set a character's behavior in more detail. In terms of disabled abilities, the only spell I recommend disabling is Dispel. This is because in my experience, the AI of the party members isn't advanced enough to understand when to use Dispel. So while I think that it's a super important and useful spell, you will have to use it manually instead of having Dorian use it on his own. Barrier should be set to preferred. This is truly the best supporting spell in the game, so you really do want any of your mages to be constantly using it to keep various party members protected. Horror, once you get it, should also be set to preferred. Any kind of status effect that can disable enemies' attacks and movement for a while is amazing, so you do absolutely want Dorian to use this very often. Not sure how many stronger or boss-type enemies are immune to this disabling effect, however, so in those cases, you may just want to tweak the tactics for this to be on active or even disabled if you think it's not worth casting at all during a boss fight. Walking Bomb is an amazing spell that does spirit damage, which is not resisted by enemies, so also set this one to preferred. Especially when it has its virulent upgrade, it's going to help you out a lot against larger groups of enemies. Flashfire is the final spell I would set to preferred because it has the panic status effect, which is very useful to inflict onto enemies. It also does a good amount of damage to a single target. Winter's Grasp is able to freeze enemies, which is amazing, but Dorian doesn't really specialize enough in cold damage and freezing effects for this spell to be something that he uses super often. Of course, in situations where you're fighting fire-resistant or fire-immune enemies, you will want Dorian to use his ice and lightning spells instead. Plus, Winter's Grasp freezes enemies, and as I mentioned, any effect that stops enemies from moving and attacking is extremely valuable, so it's good to have this as an active spell. I would also set Immolate and either Chain Lightning or Lightning Bolt to active. They're good damaging spells, but you're far more interested most of the time in letting Dorian use Flashfire, Horror, Walking Bomb, and Barrier. In conclusion, Dorian is a mostly damager and debilitator type of mage, focusing on flashy and scary abilities that do lots of damage, as well as make enemies cower or run away in fear, or sometimes be frozen or shocked. He of course does have a supporting spell in the form of Barrier, which you will see I include in every single mage build because it's just that useful, but mostly he's a damage dealer. Dorian is my favorite mage to take along on my Inquisitor's adventures, even when my Inquisitor is a mage, which is in most of my playthroughs. I really like his personality, and his voice actor does an amazing job elevating his dialogue. In terms of his combat abilities, I unfortunately can't say he feels very distinctive, because mage gameplay is very much simplified compared to Origins and even DA2. Other than Dorian's stellar companionship, you could literally have any of the mage companions with you, and they'd mostly be able to do the same thing other than the necromancy spells. Most mage builds end up looking quite similar because there's only so many spells. Lots of upgrade options and passive abilities, but overall you have 3 types of elemental spells to choose from: Fire, Ice, and Lightning, the Spirit Tree for utility, and then you have 3 specializations which aren't necessarily that inspiring. Anyway, don't want this to turn into a why Inquisition combat is bad video, so I'll say that even with the smaller number of spells available to mages, mage combat still feels pretty fun, mainly due to the cool animations and visual effects of the spells, and I enjoy Dorian as a character. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this build guide for Dorian Pavus in Dragon Age Inquisition. If you're looking forward to more videos about Dragon Age and other games I like, do remember to subscribe, and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. A special thank you to my members who help keep this channel running. I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider joining the channel as a member to support me and unlock perks like early access to videos. This has been B Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.